Oxford Bookworms Library Fact Files. Stage 2. Stephen Hawking by Alex Raynham. Read by Nigel Pilkington. Published in copyright Oxford University Press, 2018. Chapter 1. Scientist and Thinker. It is April 2015, and hundreds of people, young and old, are sitting in the famous Sydney Opera House in Australia. Great singers often come to the Opera House, but the people here tonight have not come to listen to music. They have paid a lot of money for tickets to hear a talk by a scientist. And there is not an empty seat in the room. Everyone is excited when they see the world-famous scientist who is going to speak. It is Stephen Hawking, but he is not really here. There is a hologram of him in the Opera House, a special picture of him that looks real. Stephen Hawking himself is thousands of kilometres away in Cambridge, England. He sits in his wheelchair. His body is still because he can only move his eyes and face, and he can only speak through a computer. "Hello, can you hear me?" he asks the crowd. "Yes!" they shout excitedly. Stephen Hawking is one of the greatest thinkers of our time. That evening in Sydney, he talks about his life and his ideas. And he also tells funny stories. At the end, when people leave the Opera House, they talk about their wonderful evening. They have laughed with Stephen Hawking, and they have also thought about some very big questions. Why are we here? Where did the universe come from? Does time have a beginning and an end? Stephen Hawking always tries to answer these questions, not just for scientists, but for ordinary listeners too. Because he tries to explain things for people, and because of his great life story, he has become a star. Stephen Hawking has had to use a wheelchair for most of his life, and today he cannot move, eat, or speak without help. So how does he live and work from day to day? When did he become famous? And what are his most important ideas? Chapter 2. Early Years. Stephen William Hawking was born in Oxford, England, on the 8th of January 1942. On that same day, some people were remembering the death 300 years earlier, of another great man who studied the night sky, Galileo Galilei. Stephen was the oldest of 4 children. He had 2 sisters and a much younger brother. His father, Frank, was a doctor and scientist who studied diseases. Stephen's father and his mother, Isabel, both had degrees from Oxford University, one of the best universities in the world. They were a very clever family, and the Hawkings often all sat and read books at the table while they were eating dinner. The family home during Stephen's earliest years was in Highgate, North London. Stephen was only born in Oxford because Britain was at war with Germany at that time, and people thought that London was too dangerous for babies. A few years after the war, when Stephen was 8 years old, the family moved to St. Albans, a small town about 30 kilometres north of London. The Hawkings' house in St. Albans was big, old, and very cold in winter, but Stephen loved it. He and his sister Mary liked to find lots of different ways into their house. They often climbed up the outside and then went in through open windows. Stephen was a good climber, and he sometimes climbed trees too. His mother Isabel often took her children out into the garden at night. On warm summer evenings, they lay on their backs and looked up at the night sky. Even then, Stephen was very interested in the stars. He also liked to ride bicycles, dance, and play tennis. Stephen liked to understand how things worked, and he often built little aeroplanes and boats. Nobody had computers at home or school in those days. But when Stephen was 16, he and some school friends built a computer from pieces of old machines. It was not very good, but they could use it to do mathematics problems. Stephen did not like school very much, but he had some good friends there. They enjoyed talking together about things like science and music. Stephen's friends called him Einstein because he was so clever. His teachers knew that he was clever too, but he was always laughing and making jokes at school, and he did not work very hard. He was not a good student. Stephen began to work harder in his last year at school because he wanted to study science at Oxford University. He became a student there, at University College when he was only 17 years old. He studied physics for his degree. Physics is very difficult to understand for most people, but it was easy for Stephen, so he did not have to work as hard as many other students. And Stephen did not need to write a lot of notes, because he could remember things very easily. Stephen was younger than many of the other Oxford students, and he felt lonely at first. But that changed when he discovered rowing. Stephen was the cox. He did not row, but he sat at the front of the boat and told the rowers to go faster or slower, left or right. Stephen wanted his rowing team to go faster than the other teams, so he often did dangerous things to go past their boats. He sometimes took his team's boat very near to other boats and even hit them. After a difficult start, Stephen had a great time at Oxford. He had many friends in the rowing team, and he liked to listen to music with them and go to dances. Stephen often stayed out with his friends late at night and had to climb over the walls to go back to his room, because his college closed its doors at midnight. Stephen left Oxford University in 1962 with a very good degree. So he decided to go to Cambridge University and study for a PhD. A PhD is a higher university degree, and anyone who wants to become an important scientist or teach at a university needs to get one. The summer before he went to Cambridge, Stephen travelled across Europe with a friend in trains and buses, and then went on to Iran. It was a wonderful journey, and for the first time, Stephen was far away from his family. He could go anywhere and do anything. He was a happy young man, and he had a great life in front of him. But a few months later, everything changed. Chapter 3. Marriage. One day in Stephen's last year at Oxford University, he was walking down some stairs at his college when he suddenly fell. Friends helped him, but for a few minutes, Stephen could not remember who he was or anything about his life. The accident worried Stephen, but his doctor did not think that there was anything wrong with him. Nobody knew that he was really very ill. Stephen started at Cambridge University in October 1962. He knew that he did not feel right, and his arms and legs were not as strong as before. But he tried to forget about these problems and enjoy life. For his PhD, Stephen was studying cosmology, how the universe works. Cambridge was a good place for studying physics because it was home to many great scientists. It was a good place in other ways too, because there were lots of young people, music, and parties. Stephen went home to St. Albans for the winter holidays in December 1962. There he saw his family and his old school friends, and he went to a New Year party. At the party, Stephen met a girl called Jane Wilde, and they soon became good friends. Stephen was happy, and he looked well too. But one day that winter, Stephen was outside with his mother when he fell and could not get up. His mother took him to the doctor, and just after his birthday in January 1963, Stephen went into hospital. The doctors kept him in hospital for 2 weeks, and at last they explained what was wrong. Stephen had a disease called ALS. He was only 21, and the doctors thought that he would only live for 2 more years. Not many people get ALS, but it is a terrible disease. If you have ALS, it slowly becomes harder and harder to move your body. First, it becomes difficult to move your arms and legs. And then, after a time, you cannot eat, speak, or move your head. Usually, in the end, people with ALS die because they cannot breathe anymore. When Stephen's mother asked a doctor, "What can we do to fight the disease?" the answer was nothing. This was a terrible time for Stephen, but he tried to be strong. One night, he had a strange dream. In the dream, some people wanted to kill him, and while he waited for death, Stephen thought about his life. Then he knew that he wanted to do lots of things. The dream helped Stephen. He knew now that he must not just feel sorry for himself. Perhaps he did not have a lot of time, but in that time he needed to try and live an ordinary life. So after some time at home, Stephen went back to Cambridge and began to study for his PhD again. That June, Stephen took his friend Jane Wilde to a big summer party in his college, Trinity Hall. Music played and lights burned in the gardens of the beautiful 500-year-old college. People laughed, ate, and talked. Stephen could not move very well by then, because his legs were not very strong anymore. But Stephen and Jane listened to music, and they tried to dance. Stephen had blue-grey eyes and a big smile, and Jane liked being with him. Stephen liked Jane very much too. She was clever, funny, and beautiful. For a few hours that evening, Stephen could try to forget about his troubles and enjoy life. After that summer party, Stephen and Jane often met in London, because Jane was studying French and Spanish at university there. Jane knew that Stephen was very ill, but she loved him, and they decided to marry. This changed Stephen's life and gave him hope for the future. Jane and Stephen got married in July 1965. They did not have very much money, but they were happy together. Stephen now needed a stick to walk, and he could not easily hold a pen and write anymore. But after 2.5 years with ALS, he was still alive and doing well. Everything felt possible, and Stephen and Jane never talked about his disease. They both wanted to think about life, not death. They went to America that summer. Stephen went to physics lectures at Cornell University, and he and Jane also visited many great places in New York. Did anyone see them when they stood at the top of the Empire State Building one day and looked down at the streets of Manhattan? When Stephen became a famous scientist years later, everybody knew his name. But nobody knew him then. He was just another British visitor to New York, a young man standing next to his wife on top of the world.